You see, after we have this whole incident with the Bay of Pigs, Khrushchev meets with Kennedy in Vienna, Austria, and they're discussing the future of Berlin. Remember, Berlin at the time was divided, right? Remember, it was divided at the time. And they want to discuss that future, what to do with this divided Berlin. Khrushchev wants, of course, the West to leave Berlin, right? Why wouldn't he? He wants the West out of there, get that democracy out of there. Kennedy, of course, is not going to leave. And so the response here by Khrushchev, especially since the Bay of Pigs invasion, was to play hardball with Kennedy. Instead, what he does is he says, you know what? This West Berlin, located inside communist East Germany, this is a focal point. This is kind of the front line of democracy versus communism. So what he does is, and when Kennedy refuses to leave it, Khrushchev builds an actual wall. He used to barricade it with the army, if you remember. He did that once before in the 40s and the 50s, but now he's going to actually build a wall around it, and it becomes a kind of a symbol of that communist repression and that division between East and West during the Cold War. Short answer question. So you're going to see this 30 years, this wall be a symbol between East and West, and it's a symbol to Kennedy that Khrushchev is not going to take things like the Bay of Pigs or democracy in his backyard sitting down. He's going to stand up to it. Here's a picture of that wall where we have on this side East Berlin and East Germany, which of course is communist. On this side we have West Berlin and West Germany. You can see the speech here, right? The graffiti indicating freedom of speech. And this right here, this blank area, this is the kill zone. If you're an East German resident and you cross into the kill zone, they will shoot you. You are not permitted to flee. So when all of this happens, we've got kind of this failed Bay of Pigs. We've got Khrushchev upping his support for Cuba. We've got tension rising over Berlin. And what we end up discovering is that Khrushchev, in an attempt to show support for Cuba and in retaliation for the Bay of Pigs and our failure to leave Berlin, he begins setting up missiles in Cuba. And our U-2 spy planes take photographs showing that they have long-range missiles in Cuba, missiles that can hit pretty much anywhere in the continental United States, as that map shows you. Here are two of the photographs that we actually saw, that we actually took. You can see the missile shelter tent. This is where the missile is actually located. This is with the erector, fuel tanks, trailers, movers. So you can see the spy photographs that we had. There was no doubt that, in fact, the Soviets were erecting missiles at several different locations. Here's two of them that I'm showing you, right? You can see two of the missile locations. And the reason why this is particularly problematic is that the tension, as this kind of rises, gets really anxious. What happens here is that President Kennedy orders a naval quarantine. He says here that you've gone and installed nuclear missiles in Cuba. Well, we are going to barricade Cuba and warn the Soviet Union that if any Soviet missile is launched from Cuba, we will retaliate on Cuba and on the Soviet Union. We then, on the same day, October 22nd, increased the readiness of our forces, including nuclear alert. 2 days after that, the Soviets send ships closer and closer to the naval blockade that President Kennedy establishes. Here's the blockade right here. You can see it. And Kennedy warned the Soviets that if their ships crossed into the blockade, he would open fire, including anything up to and in the use of nuclear missiles. So what Khrushchev does is, as that happens in the 24th of October, he does turn those ships around. But what he does say is that this is an act of aggression. He says that the blockade itself is aggression, and we send our forces to DEFCON 2, the last step away from war, nuclear war. The CIA tells us on the 25th of October that those missiles are ready to fire, and Kennedy is actually considering invasion. He's telling this to Khrushchev in a series of telegrams that he's ready to consider invasion. And then all of a sudden we have some back and forth. The Soviets say, we'll take the missiles down if you don't invade Cuba. Americans come back and say, you know what? We want our pilot back. We don't want these missiles here. Bottom line, what's going to happen is that America will remove its missiles from Turkey near the Soviet border. See, we had nuclear missiles too, right here in Turkey, and they could hit Moscow, just like the Soviets had missiles in Cuba that could hit Washington, D.C. So we agree to pull our missiles out of Turkey. They pull their missiles out of Cuba. We promise not to invade Cuba, and everything kind of cools down. To lessen the chance of this, we ban nuclear testing. We install the hotline, the red phone, the bat phone between Washington and Moscow to make sure that everybody's safe. This is the closest that Kennedy comes to nuclear war.